Everyone, good evening. I'm Kara Carmack, the Exhibitions and Public Programs Officer at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Spring 2023 Evening Lecture Series. We're thrilled to host an evening dedicated to the life and work of Robert Winthrop Chanler. Those familiar with the school's history and our spaces will remember that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney commissioned Chandler to design the interior of her studio in 1918. A remarkable room now part of the studio school. Tonight we'll learn more about that space and others designed by Chandler from our distinguished guests. Before we begin, I would like to note that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is free to the public with support in part by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional funding is generously provided by the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and individual donors. Please consider making a donation to help keep our evening lecture series free by clicking on the support button on our homepage. Thanks to those of you joining us virtually and here on 8th Street. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments. Off of the clay room to the left, the Whitney studio will be open this evening, and I invite you to please enjoy the experience of one of Chandler's masterpieces in person. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. Drapala is a design historian and architectural conservator who first encountered Chandler's work in 2008, conducting a materials analysis of Chandler's interior for the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney Sculpture Studio downstairs, now part of the studio school. She's currently pursuing her PhD in design history, history of decorative arts and material culture at Bard Graduate Center, and teaches in Pratt Institute's History of Art and Design Department. Her dissertation research focuses on Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and her female contemporaries' patronage of immersive decorative interiors in the early 20th century. Thomas Venturella holds a BFA in painting from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Chicago. While working at a prominent stained glass studio in Manhattan, Venturella met the Belgian artist Benoit Gilsol and fabricated many of his stained glass windows. In 1985, he established Venturella Studio, where he remains owner, operator, and senior conservator. Venturella and his colleague Jim Murphy were involved in the restoration of Chandler's stained glass windows, originally installed in Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio. He is a member of the American Institute for Conservation. Gina Wouters is president and CEO of Planting Fields Foundation, which stewards Planting Fields, a 409-acre Olmsted Brothers designed historic estate. She spent most of her professional career working to preserve and revitalize historic sites, with an emphasis on estates from the Gilded Age and Country Place era. Prior to joining Planting Fields, Gina was curator of Viscaya Museum and Gardens in Miami, Florida. Then Vice President of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator at Cheekwood Estate and Gardens in Nashville, Tennessee. Her degrees include a BFA from Barry University and an MA in Dutch art in a European context from the University of Amsterdam in her native Netherlands. Gina is completing her PhD at the University of Leicester in the UK, situating the global phenomenon of contemporary artists as catalysts for organizational change at historic sites. Now please join me in offering a warm welcome to Lauren, Tom, and Gina.
Before I begin, I just want to thank Kara Carmack for the invitation to speak on a space that has shaped my own life, both personally and professionally. Robert Winthrop Chanler's surviving decoration for Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio along McDougal Alley is a testament to the unique personal relationship between an artist and the woman he often addressed as patronne. But it is a rare surviving interior from a period when the boundaries of modernism in American art were still actively being formed. These boundaries were shifting both pictorially as well as spatially, moving between realism and abstraction, the canvas and the plane, the past and the future. Chandler proudly described his work as decorative, believing that true art was lived within and among. It expressed newly formed ideas about psychology, spiritualism, and alternatives to Western philosophy. This year marks 100 years since the completion of Chandler's masterpiece at the Whitney Studio on 8th Street, and I'm thrilled to spend this evening in conversation with my respected colleagues about its visionary. Tonight's title comes from a journal entry written by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney shortly after meeting Chandler in April 1906. After a 2-hour trip visiting galleries together, she wrote, "How fine he is in his way. Put aside the fact of his being a fraud and a flirt, and he is inspiring. To hear him talk about art, to hear his ideas, to see great truths coming from him is worthwhile. He says, live, get all you can out of life, and he wishes the best of all things. I am sure that he is a genius, and to know such a man and to hear him talk freely and truly about himself, that is an experience and one worth having." So with that said, I hope our discussion tonight will reflect Gertrude's own words and be an experience and one worth having. For nearly 2 decades until the mid-1920s, Chandler steadily produced a series of elaborate screens, panels, and decorative interiors for wealthy patrons eager to own the artist's work. These spaces often arose through social connections he held with prominent women in New York and reflect the increasing interests of an independent group of women that began to craft rooms of their own that signaled their modernism, their economic abilities, and their relationships with figures outside of their domestic spheres. Many of the works display an unsettling feral animal ferocity spread across the media of wood, paint, plaster, metal, and stained glass. While Chandler advertised himself as an individual practitioner, as seen in this arts and decoration advertisement from 1921, he maintained a skilled workshop of artisans to accomplish his more ambitious projects, relying on the collaborative expertise of the team to translate many of his ideas into form. Robert Chandler was born into a well-known and established family of American aristocracy, with a family tree that prominently featured the names Ward, Astor, Stuyvesant, Delano, and Livingston. The tragic early death of his parents in 1875 and 1877 left 10 children, collectively known as the Astor Orphans, who were brought up at Rokeby in Barrytown, New York, the family's Hudson Valley estate. Shown in this family tree are the 8 siblings that survived into adulthood, whose affairs were largely managed by trustees and guardians until they came of age. Robert's siblings led dramatic lives in their own right, which have been documented in the book The Astor Orphans by Lately Thomas, if you want to read more about them. Robert, however, was always a bit rebellious since his youth and balked at conventional education, social dynamics, and relationships. After forming what was deemed to be an inappropriate relationship to his sister-in-law, the writer Amelie Reeves, he was safely sent to London in 1888 to begin crafting his own path in art. Throughout much of the 1890s into the turn of the century, Chandler belonged to a large expatriate community of artists throughout France, England, and Italy. On April 12, 1893, he married Julia Remington Chamberlain. Upon his marriage, he decided to become an artist professionally, moving with Julia to Paris to study with various artists, including at the academies Carl Rossi and Julian, before moving into Italy to commence what art historian Betsy Fallman has termed an eclectic visual education, self-education in Italian Renaissance art. Chandler was a member of the New York State Assembly in 1904, and he and Julia divorced in 1907, during a year when Chandler was elected sheriff of Dutchess County in New York and remained in that office for 3 years, earning him the lifelong nickname Sheriff Bob for the remainder of his life. While I won't have time to discuss the full extent of his career, Chandler turned to portraiture during the early 1920s, a genre that absorbed him for the rest of his career. However, his primary focus throughout his career was the production of large-scale panel paintings, decorative screens, and immersive interiors in the first decades of the 20th century. By his own admission, Chandler extensively studied medieval tapestries and the decorative traditions of the Italian Renaissance fresco painting throughout his formative years in Europe, but he was undoubtedly influenced by one of the most successful and famous American living artists, the expatriate painter John Abbott McNeill Whistler, who had been living in Paris and running a studio there during Chandler's artistic training. Whistler's Peacock Room for Frederick Leland of 1877 was well known, having been purchased by the collector Charles Lang Freer in 1904 and transported to the United States to become what would eventually be known as the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C. in 1923. Through Whistler, he learned to combine a hybrid style of cultural influences inspired by Chinese lacquer screens, Western art historical decoration, and spiritualism in animal imagery throughout different cultures and time periods. Undoubtedly inspired by harmony in blue and gold, Chandler completed his suite of shimmery gold and red panels featuring the flamboyant creature while studying in Europe in 1900. And the panels were widely exhibited throughout his lifetime, first shown in the United States at the George Gleisner and Company Galleries in New York in 1903. The suite was eventually purchased in Paris in 1924 by Mrs. Pendleton Crocker of San Mateo, California, and the screens were included in many exhibitions, traveling more than 30,000 miles before she acquired them. Chandler was clearly fascinated by Whistler's use of decorative overdrive for these fiercely beautiful birds, as peacocks appeared regularly throughout his work and as a staple in his signatures. This decorative experiment, along with an early mural of poppies and crows that survives at the Chandler family estate, Rokeby, document Chandler's interest in painting beyond the boundaries of the canvas and enveloping entire rooms in a comprehensive scheme. In 1905, Chandler exhibited a work entitled Giraffes at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. Among Chandler's first serious ventures into decorative fantastical painting, this panel featured long, slim-necked animals inhabiting a world not of tropical trees, but of cool white birch trees bearing oranges as their fruit. The fanciful depiction won honorable mention and achieved international acclaim during the Salon, and was later acquired possibly by the French government. As of 1922, it was part of the collection of the Jeu de Paume. Notably, the 1905 exhibition where giraffes debuted was the same one that prompted critic Louis Vassel to label a group of painters fauves, or wild beasts, thus marking the birth of fauvism. The exhibition Salon d'Automne has been called the first gallery of the avant-garde in France. In 1910, Chandler famously married and then quickly separated from Lina Cavalieri, an Italian opera singer touted as the most beautiful woman in the world. The divorce was heavily publicized and threatened his inheritance. Chandler had signed an extraordinary prenuptial agreement in which he pledged to give Cavalieri much of his fortune and property, causing his famously mentally unstable brother Archie to cable him 3 famous words, "Who's loony now?" These words followed him throughout his life. The separation prompted a permanent move from Paris to New York City, where Chandler leased and then purchased 2 townhouses on East 19th Street, which he would dub his House of Fantasy. Located at 147, 149 East 19th Street, visitors to the site today can still admire the giraffe panels by Charles Cary Rumsey over the door entrances to Chandler's former home. The panels reference one of Chandler's most famous paintings, Giraffes, which we already discussed. You might notice in the image on the upper left that Chandler is standing at 6'4" and is dwarfed by his giraffe's canvas behind him. As art historian Betsy Fallman has written, quote, "No other popular artist produced paintings in this consistently large during the period within which he worked," end quote. The House of Fantasy would serve as the studio where some of his largest commissions were conceived and produced on the top level studio. The properties were remodeled for Chandler by architect Frederick Sterner in 1912. Prior to Chandler's lease, the buildings had served as rooming houses with as many as 28 tenants living there in 1910. The building was the artist's primary residence from 1912 to 1930, where he lived between extended stays in Europe and summers either in his farm in Red Hook, New York, or as part of the artist's colony in Woodstock, the Maverick Colony. As painter George Biddle claimed, it was, quote, "Here at the House of Fantasy, one met of the youthful eagerness, the postbellum intellectual sexual emancipation, the aesthetic curiosity, the bohemianism, and the promiscuity of the period, end quote. The house belonged to a well-known streak populated by actors and cultural figures and artists known as the Block Beautiful. It became the focus of a dynamic social scene and folklore of what Chandler's next-door neighbor, Carl Van Beckton, termed the splendid drunken 20s. Oh, sorry, skipped ahead. The Animal Annex, also known as the Conservatory, was located in the backyard of number 147 and was one of the most technologically innovative spaces in the building. The space housed a medium-sized pool for herons and flamingos to bathe. You can see some of those in the photo with him and Henry Cluse Jr. on the left. Above the pool was a vine-colored glass roof, on top of which an elaborate lighting scheme could alternate between settings that would mimic silvery moonlight and a morning sunrise. The lighting was controlled by a host of lamps that shined through the roof and the green glass of the side walls. Chandler's aquatic collection included goldfish, angelfish, devilfish, seahorses, eels, frogs, turtles, and horseshoe crabs. Chandler contracted with the New York Edison Company to devise a heating system to protect his exotic fish from winter weather in New York. The light installations were set up of electric switches that illuminated living models of, quote, various creatures that fly, swim, and crawl. Chandler's assortment of living specimens was diverse. Much like the extensive library he kept, animals were collected on many of the artist's excursions and used as reference sources in his art. The tropical fish in his aquarium were no doubt inspired by his travels to Bermuda to study angelfish in 1911. I'm showing some images that are at Rokeby of photographs of sketches that he had taken, presumably on some of these travel trips. And in 1912, he's shown on the upper right there, visiting Arizona, and undoubtedly on this trip is where he collected the rattlesnakes and Gila monsters, which made up part of his collection. While working to reproduce exotic animals in paint and plaster, Chandler studied the creatures either in his private menagerie or at one of the newly founded modern zoos in New York or Paris, such as the New York Zoological Society, which was founded in 1895, at their location, the Bronx Zoo, which opened in 1899, or at the New York Aquarium, which opened in 1896. Often credited as the first introduction to European modernism in the United States, the 1913 Armory show was a watershed moment in American art practice. Art historian Laurette McCarthy has completed a detailed analysis of catalogs for the Armory show, revealing that Chandler exhibited around 25 screens throughout the show's 3 weeks in Manhattan and at least 9 in the Chicago exhibition. The presence of so many works by Chandler in the Armory show was undoubtedly due in large part to the artist's connections with many of the women that supported the show's existence, several of whom either lent works to the show directly or provided financial backing for the exhibition, including Helen Hay Whitney, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Mary Williamson Averill Harriman, and her daughter Mary Harriman Rumsey, and Ruth Vanderbilt Twombly. While he admired many of the Vanguard painters and sculptors that exhibited at the Armory show, Chandler did not respect their slavish imitators, and in his painting parody of the Fauve painters, he blatantly mocked those artists, which he completed a couple of weeks after the conclusion of the show. Here we see Matisse depicted as an ape on the lower left corner, surrounded by colorful examples of his paintings, surrounded by adoring male artists who fawn over him. In actuality, Chandler's own work, and especially his later portraiture, shows an intense familiarity and respect for Matisse's oeuvre. His purchases at the show also reveal his strong interest in modernism, acquiring work by Odilon Redon, Constantine Brancusi, and Amadeo de Souza Cardoso. Chandler became an active participant in the Whitney Studio, founded in 1908, and it had several related names, including the Whitney Studio Club. The club was a place where artists could show and sell their work. In her efforts to promote American artists, Whitney was assisted by Juliana Force, who would go on to become the first director of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Socializing at the club was important and included the hiring of models for members to sketch and organizing special exhibitions. Whitney's efforts culminated in the opening of the museum that holds her namesake in 1931. Shown on this slide is a painting by Gifford Beale on the left, documenting the Whitney Studio Club's Indigenous exhibition of 1918, which served as a fundraising exhibition for World War I efforts. Whitney and Chandler are highlighted in green. On the right is an illustration of artists around Washington Square, drawn by Reginald Marsh for Harper's Bazaar in 1922. I first came to know about this image through a past New York Studio School evening lecture series talk about Gaston Lachaise by Paula Hornbostel, who's here tonight, who identified Gertrude Whitney in the car, with Chandler shown grabbing onto the car as she drives away. And I just think it's a fantastic image that shows part of the community that was in Washington Square at the time. By 1915, murals and screens by Robert Winthrop Chanler enhanced interiors of New York townhouses and country estates of Long Island and the Hudson Valley. Chandler's prominence as an artist and his social standing made the commission to decorate the dining loggia at a private women's club almost inevitable. The many and varied links he had to the club and its members were well established before the invitation to collaborate on the new clubhouse designed by architects Delano and Aldridge. Laurette McCarthy has done much of this research, showing that beginning in 1890s and throughout the first decade of the 1900s, Chandler socialized with his sisters and other Astor family members, as well as the Harrimans, Whitneys, and Vanderbilts in Manhattan, the Berkshires, Newport, and other haunts of the fashionably wealthy. By the mid-19-teens, he had become close friends with many members of these families, particularly the women who, along with his sisters, Margaret and Elida, belonged to this club. The dining loggia was undoubtedly one of the largest undertakings of Chandler's career, and his decorative designs for the room were an impressive feat of painting. The room's approximately 75 by 25 feet, with a ceiling composed of 7 groin vaults segmented by arches, and Chandler's murals feature on its walls the arches and wall niches with a, quote, a trellis design and hundreds of brilliant exotic birds. And to my knowledge, all unique. You know, when you're actually in the space, each one has its own personality and don't appear to be duplicated from each other. In the same year, 1915, the interiors for Whitney's artist studio in Old Westbury were completed. William Delano again served as the architect, designing the building between 1910 and 1912. The original 2-story Palladian-style villa was constructed on a roughly square floor plan and featured white stucco walls with festooned garland frieze at the attic story, topped with a marble balustrade at the roof line and enclosed with a formal garden designed by landscape architect Charles Welford Levitt. The interiors featured murals and screens by Howard Gardner Cushing, Robert Winthrop Chanler, and Maxfield Parrish, with mosaic installations by Viscaya decorator Paul Chalfin. This building was the most remote of all of her working spaces, host to only intimate entertaining and limited staff and assistants. And this is the space that I'll be focusing on primarily for my dissertation research. Leading off of the staircase on the second floor is a master bedroom suite painted by Robert Winthrop Chanler in his studio. The bedroom features gold on black painted canvases with Renaissance perspectival scenes depicting scenes of court life, military parades, and battles in a background of fantasized medieval stone castles. The bathroom, in contrast, is saturated on every surface with colorful underwater creatures painted in impasto with metallic paints on stretched canvas. Chandler's interior spaces, in addition to showcasing his technical ability, symbolically represented the psychological makeup of the clients for whom they were made. Christian Brinton, in the catalog for Chandler's 1922 exhibition of screens at the Kingore Gallery in New York, described Chandler's work as anticipated, quote, the new psychology of decoration, end quote. Art historian Deborah Silverman has written about the new psychology as it relates to the psychologie nouvelle, a reference to the influential symbolist art-making practices of late 19th century France, with which Chandler would have been very familiar during his residency in Paris. The movement posited that interior spaces through accumulation of material symbols, served as an arena of self-discovery for viewers. Chandler's interiors and screens often employed sensory sumptuousness as a reflection of the person's inner consciousness. The theme of Whitney's Westbury studio bathroom was first explored in Chandler's 1912 two-sided screen featuring Fight Under the Sea and Astrological, two of the sides of the same screen, in which the artist vividly realizes the lattice-like tentacles of seaweed in an all-over composition and limited color palette. The image above shows the screen reproduced for a publication of the Salon of Decorative Art in 1912 in Paris. A later version of this screen was made for Whitney, and it prominently featured in her studio along McDougal Alley, just steps from where we are sitting right now. According to Chandler's biographer and business partner, Ivan Narodny, this screen is a, quote, symbolic fairy tale of the deep sea, end quote, that features, quote, those elemental life forces outside and within ourselves, which we both fear and love, end quote. The fluid composition of works like this notably depart from the more restrained style of works such as Giraffes, which Narodny described as cold, serene, and architectural in comparison. The opposing side is titled Astrological and features a constellation of stars and planets through which a dragon emerges. While the image above is held in a private collection and shows us what it would have looked like in the original space in Whitney's studio. The only surviving photograph of Chandler's decoration for Whitney's studio is this 1928 photograph featuring Whitney's maquette for the War Monument in Springfield, Massachusetts. The design for the room is deeply inspired by the undersea astrological screen, highlighted with a red arrow in this image, so you can see it over in the side there, as well as another work done by Chandler, the 1913 Flames panel, which was also purchased by Whitney and was also displayed in this space. In Flames, a swirling fire engulfs a shadowy figure in the medieval style structure behind him. A letter from Chandler to Whitney dated January 19th, 1918 is the first mention of the studio project and the fireplace and ceiling. Quote, the ceiling is finished and the fireplace is beautiful. The mantle is fair, simple, and will not bother you. Fair and simple. He comments that John Singer Sargent had been by with his sister-in-law and that Sargent admired the screen, the flame picture, and the ceiling, but he wanted a bigger dragon in the sky, saying, we got the idea from the back of your screen. In the same letter, Chandler declared, I do not think we need the dragon. As a whole, the letter indicates that he enjoyed the independence in his working process, as Whitney was clearly absent during the execution of the fireplace. The studio space was located in a converted 1877 carriage house along McDougal Alley, where a number of Whitney's artistic contemporaries had begun establishing themselves in their artist studios. This was the first property that Whitney purchased on the site in 1907, and she would go on to connect this space to 7 additional properties that would serve as the first home of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and today as the New York Studio School. Chandler sculpted a fireplace chimney of plaster and cast bronze frames that transitions into a plaster bas-relief coved ceiling that extends across the entire space. The interior is still very legible as a hayloft for its earlier carriage house. 19th century bricks and window openings offer sunlight that is complemented by the 1907 addition of a skylight to accommodate a working sculpture studio. In each of the 7 windows in this space stood a stained glass window that no longer survives in the space. Since Whitney's death in 1942, the windows were removed and separated into private collections until recently being reunited by a private collector. I will refrain from discussing these windows in too much detail because we have the pleasure of hearing more about them from my colleague, Tom Venturella. But what I will say is that the effect from these windows, the effect that these windows had on the interpretation of the space is not to be underestimated. They would have filtered a vibrancy of colors around the shimmering surfaces of the fireplace and the ceiling that I would imagine would have the effect of transporting its visitors to another realm. In the brief visits I took to Tom's studio while him and Jim were working on these windows, the effect was nothing short of magical. There's limited visual descriptions of this space in addition to having limited photography of the space. And so I've included this, this quote from the biography for Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney by B.H. Friedman. It describes some of the paint colors and qualities of the space, the idea of these mostly bright and red gold blazing from the floor 20 feet up the chimney into sculptural forms that flatten into low relief. And amidst all of these sculptural features, you'll find nymphs, birds, fish, reptiles, dragons, gargoyles, a fantastic world of real and imagined animals. I worked with photographer Joseph Elliott and John Hinchman of the Architectural Conservation Laboratory at University of Pennsylvania to document this ceiling's decoration with orthorectified photography, the product of which produced a measured photograph that was made to scale with uniform raking light. This had allowed, for the first time since it had been overpainted, the opportunity to analyze the individual figures that figured throughout the bas relief. The figural maps that I'm showing here reveal the spheres of subject matter throughout the design of the ceiling, revealing a composition of figures that can be read as an astrological map in a landscape of stars. The intimacy of this astrological themed ceiling can be compared to the much grander and more public contemporary and another famous Vanderbilt funded building, Paul Hallou's celestial ceiling design for Grand Central Terminal, completed in 1913. As interpreted by art historian Elizabeth Frasco, Chandler's design for the studio would have created a, quote, total impression, end quote, of flickering light from the stained glass windows and reflections from the metallic fireplace and ceiling. Of the few elements that survive in Chandler's Gramercy Park residence, the House of Fantasy, one small bas-relief plaster fragment remains on the underside of a staircase in number 149. The piece, its original paint scheme obscured by a blanket of white overpaint, displays a bare-breasted female archer aiming her bow above a leaping porpoise. The same figural group has been identified in the decorative plaster ceiling at Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney studio. While Chandler occasionally created multiple copies of the same decorative scream for different clients, this fragment confirms that some of the design motifs from Chandler's private commissions were also integrated into the interiors of the artist's own home. The ceiling has a very complex composition that's worthy of its own talk, but I wanted to quickly note that many of the individual scenes have a corollary to famous examples in printed material found in Chandler's former library, the majority of which survives at the Smithsonian's Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum library collection. Here we see an image by Alphonse Marie Adolphe de Nouvel's 1870 illustration for Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, closely resembling the nude female figure entangled in the tentacles of a giant squid on the Whitney studio ceiling. The ceiling is unique in Chandler's oeuvre because its depiction of human figures alongside animals, both real and imaginary, often includes scenes of struggle and battle. A huge component of my master's thesis was the investigation of the original paint finishes on the studio ceiling, which comprised a more than 300-page report that's available on University of Pennsylvania's website for download if anyone's more interested in looking at cross-sections and the sort of nuances of the analysis. In a very gross oversimplification of what I found, generally Chandler's original schemes were discovered under 4 layers of white and cream-based overpaints. And it was very varied in application. What the original scheme was, generally made up of loosely bound pigment-laden paint, gilded surfaces with thin glazed treatments, or glazed treatments over cream applications. So this is showing you a mock-up that I created from a 3D digital scan of the ceiling. I proposed a series of original finish schemes on a panel that depicted a number of mythical reptilian figures at the border of the sunlight, of the skylight and the central sun figure in the ceiling. In this small recreation, you can see the subtle use of reflective aluminum gilding, which was abraded to show layers of vivid underpaint, as shown in the wing of the lower left griffin figure, as well as applied finishes over layers of gilding as a glaze, as shown in the dragon figure. Based on finish analysis and microscopic exposure, the 2 reconstructions shown above reveal what the ceiling and fireplace might have looked like shortly after Chandler completed the space. The ceiling reconstruction is mine, while the fireplace reconstruction is based on the work of a student seminar held at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, overseen by conservators Michelle Marincola and Mary Jablonski. In both analyses, there was evidence of the mural being reworked multiple times, applying as many as 3 different gilding applications until Chandler or his workers achieved the desired effect, which was characteristic of Chandler's often experimental process. Thus, these reconstructions are made to be considered interpretively, and unfortunately will never be able to reveal Chandler's original paint finish because of the nature of the materials he used and the overpaint layers which seeped into the original scheme. The scheme's own change over time during Chandler and Whitney's lifetime. Interiors and decoration in particular are typically ephemeral in nature and rarely survive intact as complete ensembles. When they do survive, they are usually located in private buildings with limited access to scholars or the general public. They are rarely sold or collected, rarely considered within museum exhibitions, published catalogs, or the auction market. In addition, the nature of applied finishes presents its own unique challenges as it falls between academic disciplines of architectural history, design history, art history, and the study of decorative arts, both belonging and falling outside of each one of these fields. For all of these reasons, the continued survival of Chandler's work in the publicly accessible New York Studio School is to be treasured. This space continues to inspire and challenge our narratives about modernism and decoration in the early 20th century, as well as broadening our understanding of women as patrons of art and built space.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm gonna readjust to the podium here for a moment. Forgive me. Okay, please welcome Tom.
Thank you. Good evening. This will be very quick. One thing I was just thinking about as Lauren was talking about the restoration of the ceiling and the fireplace, the kind of leg up that we have with stained glass is being that it's not an organic material as the materials that he was using in his polychromes and his finishes, which will change over the years. Colors don't change in glass. So when we were able to restore these and bring them back to 1918, we could finally see what they looked like for the viewer for the first time they saw them. So that was kind of exciting too. Anyway, the year 1918 was quite tumultuous. World War I was officially over. The Spanish influenza was ravaging the globe, and the Russian imperial family had just been executed. And the art world was thrown into chaos with the introduction of Dada and Surrealism at the Armory show in 1913. It even showed some signs of change in the decorative arts, as shown here in the art of the glass trends of the time. While Louis Comfort was redefining realism, Harry Clark was leaning heavily into the art of illustration, and Frank Lloyd Wright almost seems to tip his hat to Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase. But by 1918, Dada and Surrealism was at its peak, and surreal is just one of the adjectives that can best describe the windows of Robert Winthrop Chanler. It was during this time that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney commissioned her close friend Chandler to decorate her studio in McDougal Alley. He created a mythical and magical space that included a sculpted polychrome fireplace and ceiling, including 7 magnificent stained glass windows of dragons, flying fish and eyeballs, bats, and a galaxy of planets and stars. Chandler was primarily known for his folding screens, paintings, and room interiors, Stained glass was not a regular medium in his artistic repertoire. These 7 Vanderbilt Whitney windows appear to be the largest ensemble he designed. One of them does contain his signature and the date, but there's no indication of the studio that fabricated them. They're beautifully crafted by a studio that has mastered all the techniques of painting, silver staining, acid etching, glass selection, and cutting, plus the skill to creatively lead these incredible panels together with leads of various profiles. In the Cole Hall archives of 1924, there's a mention that he used Bonnewitt stained glass studios for the production of some of his windows. Bonnewitt would have been very capable of producing windows this complex for the Vanderbilt Whitney studio. And based on our extensive knowledge and experience of the stained glass windows made at the Tiffany studios, I would venture to say that this firm responsible for these Chandler windows was not only familiar with, but met the extremely high standard of window production at Tiffany's. Robert Chandler himself did not execute the painting in these windows, even though he was a painter. The art of painting on glass has no relation whatsoever to painting on canvas, linen, or any other material. It takes years to master this art, and only someone who's been working as an expert glass painter would be able to interpret his drawings and cartoons with a precision accuracy that was needed for these windows. They're extremely close, well followed. With his expertise in this field, G. Owen Bonnewitt could very possibly have been the fabricator here. Unfortunately, when his studio closed in 1941, he reportedly destroyed his records and sold whatever decorated glass remained. In 2015, we received two windows by Robert Chandler for restoration. These two. We were told that these were 2 of 7 made for the Vanderbilt Whitney studio in the Village. One window had a large acid-etched blue-plated layer on its interior surface to create the mood of either the heavens or an under-the-sea effect. The other had a complex layer of toning plates on the exterior only. The green lines here indicate cracks in the glass, and the pink areas indicate missing areas of glass. The heavily acid-etched blue-plated layers needed to be removed for cleaning, as an incredible amount of carbon dirt had built up between the plates and dulled the layers of brilliant glass. In this restoration, we did also determine that the windows did not need to be re-leaded, as the leading was basically sound. But in the case of pieces with missing fragments, though, complete restoration was necessary. And here are examples of those replicated pieces. The one on the right is the original. It was pretty well broken up and shelled. The one on the left is our replacement. It's showing acid-etched red on clear glass plus the painting and to show you what some of the things that he has done. The other was a dragon claw from that particular dragon, where there was actually missing fragments in here, and you get to see an example of silver staining, which produces the orange and yellows into the glass once it's been etched. In 2019, another client informed us that he had just purchased 5 Chandler windows, original to the Whitney studio, and was now on the hunt for the other 2. With his 5 and our photographs of the 2 others, we were able to understand how they all worked together. In his lot were 2 panels with heavily acid-etched blue interior plates, looking quite similar to the one privately owned we'd worked on 5 years earlier. The other 3 related to the second privately owned window, but all 5 of these were in similar condition. Heavy soot and dirt accumulation between the plates, broken glass, and some missing fragments. Again, there's the pink and the green showing broken glass and the fragments missing. With the removal of the acid-etched blue layer, we were able to see the incredible craftsmanship that make these windows so spectacular. In the window we refer to as the Joker, an important head had been broken into many pieces and was previously repaired with lead fills and copper foil. We removed the pieces and decided to restore the original rather than replicate this head. All fragments were cleaned and edge glued. Where the glass had been removed by grossing, we did epoxy infills. And after the glue cured, we were able to handle the restored piece. We then did some in-painting to complete the missing design prior to its reinstallation into the panel. The glass used in all 7 of these windows was mouth-blown antique glass. All the detail was painted and fired on for permanence. This glass is typically used for most European and modern stained glass windows alike. The term antique refers to its manufacture and translucent qualities. It is mouth-blown and clear in color, as opposed to the American opalescent glass, which is rolled, polychromatic, and color-dense in appearance. It was surprising to find and to discover that within these plated layers, the use of some opalescent glass in only 1 window out of the 7. This added to the aquatic feel and coloration in the fish and eyeball window. This unorthodox pairing of antique and opalescent glasses is actually quite effective. Sunlight coming through these extremely rich windows is breathtaking. And in the studio, as the sun would pass along the sky, these windows would change all day long. And while they were so exciting, they were very distracting because we kept looking at the reflections. Our client actually did locate and purchase the other 2 previously restored windows and was able to reunite them all. I'm uncertain of the exact date when these windows were removed from the studio, but at the time those 7 were split up. 2 became privately owned while the other 5 remained together and eventually found their way to an antique shop in the village. Understanding the 7 and seeing contemporary photographs of the studio interior, we were able to speculate more clearly as to their original location. This is our approximation of the window's original placement in the room based on color, translucency, and theme. These 4 windows here had backplates and nothing on the front. The southern elevation of these 4 windows, let's see, that would be that. Yes, the southern elevation on these 4 windows here, it necessitated the palette to be of richer, darker colors to retain their vibrancy in such strong south sunlight, as opposed to the 3 north-facing windows, which required a lighter and more ethereal palette so that soft, even north light would neither burn them out visually nor be unable to illuminate them properly. It is my pleasure to say that all 7 now have been restored, reset into their new frames based on the originals, and complete with existing original hardware. Shortly after this project was completed, plans for a Chandler exhibition were made that would include not only these 7 windows, but screens and other items from the studio. However, unfortunately, something called COVID appeared on the scene and promptly put a stop to everything. As we are seeing our way through and past this pandemic, hopefully this long overdue exhibition highlighting the art of Robert Winthrop Chanler can be resuscitated and give attention it deserves. Being that there's no record of any names assigned to these windows, we've done our own for our restoration purposes. So here they are. Medusa, which is just insane. The squid. The bat. The fish and eyeballs. Orbital spider. The dragon. And the Joker. and hopefully we'll see them all in exhibition one day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, please welcome Gina.
All right. Hello, everybody. I am not going to be talking about Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. I'm going to take you to Miami, and I'm going to take you to Oyster Bay, and I will be spending a lot of time talking about Robert Winthrop Chanler. And he's an artist that, through my time at Viscaya and at Planting Fields, has been a part of my life for the last 15 years, except for a short breakup when I went to Cheekwood in Nashville. So I hope you'll indulge me with this talk. So while Chandler was incredibly prolific and a master of many media, his work was not designed to be accessible to the public. It was really created for an elite set. It adorned fabulous homes and clubs, and most of those, or many of those, were demolished. Many remain private, and only a few of those are still preserved today. I've had the fortune of working at the only two truly publicly accessible sites that feature Chandler's immersive work. The first one being this site here, Viscaya Museum and Gardens in Miami, Florida, and the second being Planting Fields in Oyster Bay, about 30 miles east of here. So my talk will really focus on Chandler's work for those two sites, and as well as how his work remains relevant today. So Viscaya is really an extraordinary Italian Renaissance revival house on the shores of Biscayne Bay. It's emblematic of the era of the American Gilded Age. And while it appears as if it stood for centuries, it really is a modern day construction. It's poured in place concrete and features the latest technologies. Another aspect that reveals that it was a product of its time is the fact that James Deering, who created Viscaya, was a patron of contemporary artists of his time. And a number of those, I'll just list Gaston Lachaise, who created the peacocks at the Marine Garden Bridge, Alexander Sterling Calder, father of Sandy Calder, who created the sculptural work that's on the barge right here out of limestone, Charles Carey Rumsey, who created garden ornamentation, and of course, Robert Winthrop Chanler, and many others. So Deering really, you wanted a screen from Chandler because that was kind of the status symbol. That was, as you see here, the newest fashionable fad. He wasn't really interested in an immersive space or, really not even thinking about the swimming pool ceiling as it would become. And so he got what he wanted. In 1921, he acquired this really, purposely built screen or created screen 1921 called Viscayan Bay. And this depicts the kind of this fictive encounter of the European explorers arriving at the Viscayan Bay. So this screen came after the swimming pool. But what Chandler wanted was to create the swimming pool ceiling. And there's really kind of interesting, consideration as to why he was so fascinated by that. James Deering actually paid $6,000 at that time for the screen and only contributed $5,000 towards the swimming pool ceiling, which you'll see shortly. And in his correspondence, he writes, "I'll give $6,000 for the screen and $5,000 for whatever else Chandler wants." And so this is the pool. This is the one view towards the pool, not your typical pool. It kind of fits within the Italian architecture, and the pool is partially underground underneath the building and partially exposed to the elements. Here is the commission, the underwater fantasy scene, really, that Chandler created in 1916. And so James Deering took residence officially Christmas Day, 1916. So Chandler had an incredibly quick turnaround to make this space happen, and he was commissioned in 1916, and it was completed in 1916. And a lot of problems kind of came after that. And the intent of this space was really to feel like you were swimming. That while you were swimming, you would feel as if you were underwater, and there would have been an incredible play on light that would be bounced from the water and onto the metallic fish above. It's not just about the ceiling, of course. There are mosaics made of shells in the walls. There's stained glass as well. There was landscaping. There are functioning fountains. There's sculptures. There's decorative, pieces of furniture. Not by Chandler, of course, but it was really a total work of art. Here's a small detail of one of the borders of the swimming pool ceiling. These were cast from nature, and if you can see kind of in the center bottom, the initials R.W. Chandler inscribed in that sand dollar, that blue sand dollar, and that repeats throughout the kind of the border pattern. And as romantic and as this idea of an immersive mural was, it was a really bad idea, even 100 years ago. And it really causes us to think about what was Chandler thinking, what was James Deering thinking in terms of legacy, in terms of what would be preserved 100 years from when this was created. Were they even thinking about that? Possibly not. So a major catalyst in really the stewardship and the preservation of this space occurred in 2005 when Hurricane Wilma hit Florida, the South Florida, and caused significant damage. And here you can get a sense of that. The voids that you see in the center of the ceiling are pieces of the mural that detached and fell to the bottom of the pool. The storm surge kind of came to like the middle of this room and either completely inundated the mural or the water was splashing and it really soaked it. So it was a terrible situation for this space, but also prompted a lot of consideration of its future. And what Viscaya determined is that there's a real preservation conundrum, not indifferent to what is dealt with here at the Whitney studio or other Chandler sites that still exist. So we convened an advisory group. Here you see people, including myself, and then the center is Mark Rabinowitz and Frank Matero, horrified, perplexed, baffled, not really quite sure what to do with this space. So we convened this group. We had organized a national symposium in 2015 and published a book with Monticelli Press in 2016, all really, with the intent of generating awareness, understanding, and bringing visibility to this artist, and hopefully answering some questions along the way and what to do in the preservation of his work. So I mentioned it was a bad idea, the mural, the ceiling. So it's made out of water-soluble paint. It's above a pool. It's in the Miami environment with sustained high relative humidity. It's 30 feet from the bay. And now, of course, with climate change, it's really truly a Sisyphean task. It's kind of, what is the future of this? So I left in 2017, and the museum continues to think about novel ways to preserve the space, while also making it accessible. And that's something I really want to underscore, because Viscaya is an incredible landmark. It's a destination in Miami, and it welcomes over 300,000 people a year. And people have come to the site really seeking this swimming pool now. So thinking about accessibility is kind of the dual charge for the museum. The museum has turned to technology as a solution for thinking about how to create access to these spaces and preserve them as well. So I encourage you to spend some time on their website and see what they've been doing, not specifically with this space, but with the barge by Alexander Sterling Calder that I showed in the earlier photo. So I'm going to turn over to planting fields now, where I have been since 2019. It's been a wonderful 4+ years, and I've just been finding that it's the gift that keeps on giving. I only learned about planting fields first because of the Buffalo mural by Chandler at the space when we were working on the publication, and little did I know that there was so much more to it. So it's a Tudor revival estate that's kind of nestled there within the landscape that you can see peeking out through. It's 409 acres. It's the original 409 acres that the family purchased, and it's largely landscaped by the Olmsted Brothers firm. And today it exists really as one of the largest still extant residential commissions the firm ever created. Everybody knows about Biltmore, but nobody knows about planting fields. So there's a huge opportunity for us, and we've been working hard to really revitalize the landscape and bring back the Olmsted Brothers vision for the site. So like James Deering, the Coes commissioned contemporary artists to do work at planting fields. It's easy when you see the interiors and the architecture of the space and other outbuildings to think that they were just looking to the past for inspiration, but they were very much mindful of what was happening in their day and had a finger on the pulse of what was going on. And so they commissioned Everett Shin, who was a member of the Ashkin School in the 8, to do painted furniture and murals in the tea house and in Mako's bedroom or dressing room. They commissioned Samuel Yellen, who was really at the forefront of American arts and crafts, to do a number of ironworks throughout the house and the gardens. They commissioned Chandler to do the Buffalo mural, as well as Mako's bedroom, which is called the Lace Room, or was called the Lace Room, and they engaged Elsie DeWolf for interior decoration. So this house, which is the same house that you saw from another angle, is really the second house. The first house was designed by Grosvenor Atterbury, but it burned to the ground, and by none other than our friend Chandler. So this is a article from 1918, March 28, that talks about the house being burned down. And on the top right, it references Robert Chanler, the artist, was working on decorations in a new sun parlor, and a blowtorch was ignited with some combustible materials, and the whole house burned down. But that did not deter the family. They still wanted, they were so determined, they wanted to get a singular Chandler piece to really adorn their house. So in 1918, when the new house was being built, Chandler was commissioned to create this mural, which is the Buffalo mural in the breakfast room. And it's a space that is completely immersive. Every wall is covered, the ceiling is decorated, it's painted, and it's really oriented to be the most stunning during breakfast time. So the way that the light hits the mural, really that wall, and highlights the elk and the bison is pretty extraordinary. And it reflected the Coe's love of the American West. So it's kind of confusing because you come into this house, it's Tudor Revival architecture, Elizabethan, Tudor interiors. There's actually even a French neoclassic room as well. And then you come into this room that's vaulted, that has a scene of the American West. But that's, the eclecticism of that era for you. So we worked really closely with New York State Parks, Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation to co-steward the site as a whole, but also specifically to care for this mural. So they have a talented team of conservators, painting conservators, architecture conservators in People's Island, which is slightly north of Albany. And they have been really tremendous stewards for the last decade and a half of this mural, trying to sustain it, trying to just ensure that it doesn't deteriorate any further. And it's not as vulnerable as the mural at Viscaya, but it has its own really unique challenges because it's an architectural element. And one of the interesting things that we discovered in recent years, based really on one colorized photo we have from the 1920s that shows that the sky was this much deeper blue. It was saturated. It was not kind of this strange gradiating sunset that you see. The conservators took paint samples from all throughout the ceiling and discovered that Chandler actually used lapis lazuli. It was a much deeper blue, and what you see here now is probably 2 or 3 later overpaint campaigns that were applied to this mural, unfortunately. So we now have the conundrum of thinking about what do we do with this space? It's a space that has incredible integrity as a site, as a creation of Chandler's creation. Do we restore it? Do we recreate it? Do we mechanically remove the overpaint? A lot of questions that hopefully will be answered in the next years or so. But it's really quite a special place. Chandler also was commissioned to paint May Coe's bedroom. So this is not the original bedroom mural that he created. Unfortunately, those canvases were taken down in the 1930s by the third Mrs. Coe and sent to one of the children in France, and it burned in a fire. And so this was recreated in 2010 or so by a muralist, a New York-based muralist. And she used 2 historic photographs as inspiration for this view. And it's still extraordinary. And, every time we take guests inside the space, their jaws drop. It's metallic, it's iridescent, it's bright. It's, again, completely offsets your experience in the house. And what's really pretty special, and I hope you can make it out in this one image, is that true to Chandler's original intent, the artist used lace like a trellis, like a structure, creating this structure within the room. So, yes, COVID hit in March 2020, but at that same time, we had been planning to open an exhibition on Chandler, really, a culmination of contacts, of research that was done with people who own screens, mostly private individuals all throughout the country. And we organized an exhibition that opened April 9th, 2020, and was really the first exhibition to be held of his work since the 1926 retrospective at the Grand Central Galleries, which you can see here, just one view of. There are about 60 pieces that were included in this show. in the original show, not our show. So this is just a poster that was created that gives you a sense of the 12 panels and screens that were included. Most of them were two-sided, so really there's like 20 to 24 unique works included in this. We also were able to borrow a number of archival pieces that kind of build out the story, including this lovely portrait of Chandler by Man Ray. Just gonna want to show you quickly a little snippet, and you can go online and see the whole thing if you want, but just the screens in the space. And there's music, but it's like a Pink Floyd instrumental thing, so just so all these screens came from private collections from California, Virginia, Florida, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Washington State, all to planting fields from April until September of 2020. And this really gives you a sense of the scale. I mean, these are all, 6 feet tall, 6 by 6 sometimes. I mean, really large, imposing pieces. So then, of course, shortly after the show closed, 2 screens came available at auction at a local nearby antique shop. And so we acquired these 2 screens, fortunately, through our board of trustees, and added them to our collection, which is really unique because the Planting Fields collection, co-op collection, has not grown. It's really just kind of consists of what the family acquired and pieces that fill in some gaps. And so we have a real interest in building out the story of Chandler's work, reinforcing the murals that we have there, and presenting his work in a domestic space, which it was often created for. So now I just want to turn quickly and conclude with how Chandler's art influences art today. And that's something that both Viscaya and Planting Fields have in common, and something that I've really been focusing on through my PhD the last 8 years or so, and that's thinking about how contemporary art really activates historic spaces. So Viscaya has had a contemporary art program since 2005, where they commission contemporary artists every year to do a site-responsive work, really thinking about the legacy of patronage that the family imbued to the site. And so in 2011, Naomi Fisher, who was a Miami-based artist, attended a lecture that I gave on Chandler and became fascinated by his work. And mind you that the screens, that's the same one that you saw earlier, had been relegated to storage for decades. And so she saw a visual of it, she wanted to see it in person, and she ended up creating a piece that was responding to it. And so here in the breakfast room of Viscaya, you have this historic contemporary work and this contemporary work in dialogue with each other. And the museum continues to do these commissions every single year. So of course, shortly after I came to Planting Fields, I created a program called Catalyst, which also thinks about how contemporary artists respond to the site, really for site-responsive work. And so in 2020, our inaugural artists were Mark Dion and David Brooks, who you can see on the top left. And this is a drone shot of their 2 installations in our bird sanctuary. This is a part of the landscape that was not designed by the Olmsted firm, so kind of an area we could be experimental. And so they created these commissions that are still on view. This is an interior view, kind of 2 sides of Mark Dion's posh bird blind. And these truly are blinds that you come into, you step in, there's scopes, there's field guides, there's stools, and you're able to watch nature from within this. And the camouflage, I don't know if you can make it out, but the camouflage pattern on his facade is kind of like an Escher-like pattern that also includes a number of extinct birds. And David Brooks created this piece that's inspired by the tea house at Planting Fields, but it's an open structure and it's a bird blind, and right now a habitat for humans to watch bird life. But as you can see, the trees protruding out of the roof, it will ultimately become an extended habitat for birds as the building gets dismantled. And then last October, we commissioned the artist Diana Al-Hadid to do this project. It's called The Outside In, and it was very much thinking about COVID and isolation and time spent indoors, dreaming about the outdoors. She looked to Mayco's bedroom, really inspired by Chandler's murals, and created this wonderful sculptural piece. It's 4 10 by 10 panels, so it creates a cube, and inside it is a Venus dogwood tree. So it's really a room for a tree, and she's inverting the space and bringing the outside in, as the title suggests. And here's another view. And this is not a filter. This is truly like a very foggy morning in November. And it's really quite amazing to see contemporary commissions set within such a naturalistic and natural landscape where you have extraordinary tree specimens like this oak tree. So please come and visit us. See Chandler's Buffalo mural, see our newly acquired screens, and see the contemporary art commissions that preserve the patronage of the arts that was so central to the making of planting fields. 52 kilometers, 30 miles or so, really not that far. I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much. I invite our guests to take a seat at the table as we start our Q&A. You've given us a lot to see and think about. Questions for our speakers? Yes.
Hi. All of your talks were very much about, this idea of conservatorship and restoration and knowing what the degradation is and how to fix it or when to fix it, or and I have a question about the ceiling in the Whitney in this school, and if there are any plans in motion to restore or to conserve more that ceiling.
That is a wonderful question. I don't know that I'm the best to answer it. As a architectural conservator, I was charged with analyzing that space, and so I figured out as much information as I could about those original schemes. And I spent a year trying to figure out how to develop a treatment to try and remove the overpaint. But because of the quality of the original paint, it's very loosely bound. So whenever it was painted over, that oil paint that was applied over it just seeped into that original layer. So there's really no way to remove it without the whole thing coming off. So I spent a year figuring that out, but yes. So what we're left with, and this was really interesting meeting Gina around the time that I worked with Frank Montero, and we were trying to figure out approaches to conservation. You can't approach a space like that Whitney studio in terms of recreation. It's just never gonna happen. And so it leaves this big void in what to do, but there's also a lot of potential and creativity in finding a solution. But it starts with acknowledging that there are things we'll never know. So you'll never be able to see what Chandler and his assistants put on that wall, but we have material information. We know the quality of the things that were used to make it. We have a general idea through looking at the back sections of these paint, how it was applied. But any decision that's made has to start with the kind of unknowability or the idea that it's a modern intervention. And I think that it's part of I'll leave it open to the staff from New York Studio School to speak more about that. But yeah, it's this kind of lingering question is what's appropriate. We don't really have a preservation methodology for doing that. And I think, Viscaya is an interesting counterpart to figuring out these spaces that can't if you approach restoration, they can't be restored the way that we're used to thinking about restoration.
And you mentioned his assistants, and I know that the Whitney studio took several years and Viscaya took less than a year. And Tom, you mentioned kind of the educated guesswork of who might have made the stained glass windows. And I wonder if you could speak to sort of who was working with him. Were they different based on location? And if you could speak to kind of the length or lack of length of time it took to create these spaces.
Sure. So I know one particular figure, Rudolf Gertler, who's listed as his foreman for much of the Chandler Studios period. And so he worked with Chandler like roughly about 15 years. He was he was born in Switzerland. I don't know exactly how the two met, but you can see in census records that he lived at the House of Fantasy when he first came here. He's listed in the correspondence for the Whitney studio that Rudolph glazed the ceiling so it looks less patchy. He's listed in the Viscaya records as collecting shells with Paul Chalfin. So he's all over the place. And I have an oral history by Louis Boucher, who's a contemporary decorator, that shared a studio with Gertler and discussed the fact that Chandler technically didn't know how to do much of his work, that it was Gertler that had the kind of technical proficiency. He really served as kind of the person that made it happen, like going from an idea into kind of physical form. I shared this with Tom that I found Gertler's, I've only been able to locate one piece by Gertler that came on auction. That's a kind of japanned screen on a black background with gold that looks very similar to the Whitney studio in Westbury, and an advertisement for his stained glass windows that was shown at the Wanamaker's Art Gallery. So I know that he worked in stained glass. I don't know what it looked like. And I have names that show up in like newspaper clippings and census records, but I don't have any more info. It's published as one of the chapters in the 2016 book that Gina and I contributed to. But it's a big question mark that I did my best trying to answer. But the fact is, lots of people worked on these spaces. So we give Chandler the name. It's his sort of vision, but through Tom's discussion, you know, there are obvious other collaborators on these projects.
You know, in a sense, Chandler was in the same position that Louis Comfort was, because, you know, everybody thinks that Louis Comfort actually did his lamps and his windows all by himself, which he didn't. I don't know if the guy could even cut a piece of glass or solder. But Gertler was the go-between guy. The 7 windows for the studio here are so advanced in all the techniques that we see when we're working on them, and now that we can actually see them again restored, you realize this is not his first rodeo. You know, they know what they're doing, and it was something that Chandler himself, I'm sure, he has a vision, he's got the idea, it says, I'll make it happen. And I'm certain that he had input on the final result, much like Louis would have. Nothing left those studios without these guys saying, okay, you got my imprimatur, you can go on now. And I'm sure that was a similar situation. In Bono, it was an excellent studio.
I think I'd also add that, you know, Chandler was one of the set. He was friends with Deering, he was friends with the Coes, he was friends with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and so he was spending a lot of time with them socially. So even though, for example, the Viscaya Commission we know was a quick turnaround, he was hanging out there. There's all sorts of recollections of him spending time there and you know, hanging out in the towers. He was returning there often. There's an oral history of one of the children of the Coes, and they talk about how one time they came in from hunting and he was drunk in the living room with the 2 young children who were like 13, the 2 boys were like 13 years old, and the maid Coe got really upset. So he was spending time as a guest at these places. He was returning, he was revisiting and reworking things also. So it wasn't transactional. It wasn't like he was going, making it, and it was done. He was returning.
Thank you. Hi. I'm a little unclear about what happened to these stained glass windows. Who owns them, and would they donate them back to the studio school sometime?
The 7 windows are currently privately owned. I don't think that the studio really has any thoughts about reinstalling them in any way. And putting them on an exhibition, but I think that them being privately owned, I know that there's been talk about future exhibitions, which would include all 7 of them, so they would be available to the public during certain periods.
Is there another question over here?
Thank you. Thank you all three. Your talks were each excellent and dovetailed so nicely, one with the other. And similarly, as the director of the Lachaise Foundation, Lachaise and Chandler were dovetailing in interesting ways that I'm always learning more about. And that's how I got involved in the studio school. But because Lachaise's studio was on McDougal Alley and Gertrude was a patron of his. But I learned recently that Chandler purchased a relief by Lachaise, and Lachaise did a portrait of Chandler. And I wanted to ask Gina to speak more about the quality of those buffalo, because they're metallic, and you didn't speak very much about the metallic element of it, because it kind of also relates to the chimney, I think, here. And also, I wondered, you mentioned, Tom, about the soot. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that there was a fire in the chimney place animating all these details that you've described so well, all of you, it reminded me of, I think, Isabella d'Este in Mantua. She had this room where the fireplace would animate these painted giants. Anyway, that's all.
You also have to remember that the room probably at that period was coal-fired and coal-heated. So not that the windows had gotten so much carbon probably from the fireplace, more so I would think from the heating and the coal burning, because we run into this all the time with stained glass windows, especially plated windows, which are more than one layer.
So I'm happy to answer your question about the Buffalo mural. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really definitely worth a visit, because Chandler created this real kind of sculptural installation. He built up with plaster. So in many areas of the mural, it's dimensional and so thick sometimes that, it feels really tactile. And he used a really complex kind of glazing system, both at planting fields and at Viscaya, and through the, working with various conservators and doing paint analysis that was better understood. But you can see that he used a lot of metallic powders, bronze, aluminum, silver leaf, to really kind of give the elk and the bison this iridescent quality that then really works beautifully with the way that the light hits throughout the day. And it's uniform throughout. So on each wall and the ceiling, you kind of feel they're like three-dimensional. They really come out at you.
I just wanted to add to that. With the Whitney studio, it's really fascinating is he's using aluminum leaf, which is generally considered kind of cheaper now, but at the time that he was using it in 1918, this was really innovative. This was not a material that was really available before then. And so it's interesting, in each one of these commissions, his material choices are very much based on what he can get away with, and they're experimental. So he's using it in an interesting way, right? In our reconstructions, we see that it has a very kind of golden hue to it, but throughout the entire room, it's aluminum. So it's interesting to compare between the different sites.
I just wanted to add too that Arthur Lee, the sculptor, Arthur Lee was also an assistant to Robert Winthrop Chanler, and his papers are somewhere up in Massachusetts. I'm in touch with the descendant, and I keep thinking one day, if there's time, that there might be a description of the fireplace by this assistant. I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll follow up afterwards.
I was just curious more generally about sort of your profession of conservation, restoration, and then getting into recreation. Sort of, is there a sort of accepted standard of ethics of sort of how far you can go with those things when it comes to recreation? I don't know. It's always something I've been fascinated by. And each of your specific sort of ideas on that, do you have a sort of idea of, okay, how far can we go with this? What are we allowed to do? And is that sort of determined by what's been written in wills and et cetera, that kind of thing?
Do you want to take that first? Or?
Thanks.
well, I can respond generally that there are some well sort of established standards generally for how to approach preservation. And so the National Park Service has developed their own criteria. There's the Secretary of the Interior's Historic Preservation Guidelines, which defines certain approaches. So the restoration is a specific type of approach. Preservation, meaning like a recreation. Preservation is considered just maintaining what's existing. But so there are these different kind of philosophies that you can follow that have been somewhat standardized. I think that Frank Matero wrote a really wonderful chapter for the book that Gina and Andrea edited, and it's all about preserving the fantastical in all these minefields, because we don't have it's very subjective. Our interpretation is very subjective. I can't tell you like the sigh of relief I had when the NYU students produced the report and we were like meeting in the same place, because you're looking through a microscope trying to figure out what a whole space looks like. That's my very like vague answer, is like, yes, there are some standards. The American Institute for Conservation has its own ethical sort of protocol that to be a member, you kind of sign on to honoring existing materials, making sure that your treatments are reversible, that they're sort of obvious treatments. But
being a member of AIC, that's what our goal is in restoring these windows. Our challenges are different than yours, because again, you're working with much more organic material that shifts with humidity, time, many factors. Whereas with stained glass, you don't generally get those kinds of dramatic changes. You'll get loss, you'll get badly broken pieces. What we aim for always is to retain as much original material as possible, no matter how badly damaged it is. In cases where there were missing fragments in these particular windows, we have an excellent reproduction painter who works with us, and she did beautiful work reproducing those pieces that actually needed to be replicated. There wasn't enough substantial material in what was left to be able to just reintroduce to the window and just hope and pray to God that it stays there. So we archive the original pieces. That's always archived and notated. But again, for example, the Joker's head, I looked at that and I started to do an acid etch beginning of it, and I realized this is way too complex. My reproduction is not going to look as good as this original. And being that it's buried in between two other layers of glass, I can get away with edge gluing that, putting in epoxy infills where glass has been removed to accommodate the hearts of a repair lead, and then do the design in painting over those little epoxy infills. And once it's back in place again, it's right where it's supposed to be.
So, and I'm not a conservator. I'm really a trained art historian and museologist, and working really to steward these historic sites to the public. And so, the one principle that I've always kind of heard and learned about through my different experiences is reversibility, so that whatever is done can be reversed, because there were treatments that were applied at on the Viscaya ceiling, that some sort of epoxy that can never be undone. So that kind of materiality is lost right now. But I think that this is actually, you probably hit on like the largest debate with Chandler's work, in terms of the preservation of them, and there's different considerations and perspectives, because when you think about places that are open to the public and that have now, for example, Viscaya has looked, as you see in those photos, for almost 20 years, not interpreting the space, not really, presenting the space with some sort of informed interpretation of what the artist might have intended. So, when the public becomes involved, there's a different consideration in terms of how you can study things, how long you can think about it. And that was something that, in our considerations with Viscaya, there was, I think, Frank Matero said, you can study this thing to death. You can, and endlessly, and you'll never have an answer, and you'll never have consensus of what to do with it. And if you think about ultimately what is the purpose of that space, what is the intent, what is the mission of the organization, those might sway your opinions in different ways.
So we'll squeeze in 2 more questions, one in person, one online.
Thank you. I'm trying to imagine how Mrs. Whitney used the space once the windows were in place. And it's a very high ceilinged space, and obviously lavishly colored, and then colored further by the sun as it moved across the sky with those south-facing windows. But artists usually love north light because it's regular and steady. Now, I know she was a sculptress, and maybe the color didn't mean that much in terms of affecting her work. But do you have any sense of how well it would work as an artist studio once fully decorated, as you've described it?
Well, this is what keeps me up at night. This is why I continue to ask these questions in my PhD, is because why would an artist invite these other artists to completely envelop their working space, right? This is something that she does repeatedly. She does it here and does it in Old Westbury. And the best answer that I have is that I don't think that this room operated as a sort of dirty, like a wet sculpture studio by the time Chandler gets involved with it, because she starts purchasing other properties. Her main sculpture studio goes to the space that currently exists. You'll walk through as you try to enter the space now. Given the limited documentation and sort of personal recollections, even family members that knew her that don't have recollections of this space, it's very frustrating to try and make sense of how exactly it was used. But to the best of my knowledge, it is performing something different than what we think of as a working studio, that it might have been important to her practice, but not necessarily where she's working with clay. That's the best answer I can give.
Okay, and our last question is mostly about the windows. Tom, could you please discuss the original frames of the windows? Were they metal? And when they were removed, would the frames have gone with them as well? So is it safe to say that the wooden casement windows in the studio today were fabricated later in the 40s or 50s, for example? And then a second question is, do you know anything about the atrium on the outside north wall of the studio and why it was added? Would Chandler's windows have been designed knowing that they were not going to be opening to the outside?
As far as the first part of the question, when the windows were removed, they were basically casement windows. They were all hinged. So the stained glass, which was framed by that casement, that was removed. The rest of the housing of the frame was left in the wall. One of the first 2 was actually used in a shower for a number of years. And that's why the dragon's wing and his claw needed to be replaced, because they were so badly broken and there was missing glass. The frames, the steel frames of which they were originally placed in, rotted and rusted because of all the shower water that was going on these things, which is a very interesting thought, why you would use that. People are funny. So what they had done was they replicated as closely as possible to the originals as what they would be, because they're not used as casement windows any longer. They're just individually framed. But what we did do was take any of the original hardware that was on the old frames and put those on the new frames, basically in the same positions, so that if you look at them, that you still get the feeling of what they were meant for. So that worked out really, really well, and they're very stable frames. So And the other part of your question, which was?
Yeah,
about
so
the sort of
so
atrium
there's
added
they're referring to on the north wall where the three windows. There's an overhang that goes into a enclosed courtyard between the 8th Street building and the McDougal Alley building. That was constructed before the windows. So the idea that these windows would never sort of be exposed to the outside is
The elements?
was part of Chandler's design and what Tom was talking about when you were talking about like kind of double layers of glass, right? That's why you think that they were put in those three.
Well, the reason why I put those three in there, as soon as the second set of windows came to us in 2019, we found that there were two more of these with these blue acid etch plates on them. So I looked at all seven. I think, okay, three of them have this blue on them. The other four do not. And then you look at the studio and you think there are 4 windows here and there are 3 windows over there. And I figured it didn't take rocket science to figure out that the blue ones would probably, since there's 3, would go in the 3 openings, and the other 4 would fit around the fireplace or the other end.
Yeah, it does happen.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tom, Gina, Lauren. And again, please join us downstairs in the clay room, where Gertrude probably would have shifted, for light refreshments. And then please head up to the Whitney studio and